What if the Baghdad Battery wasn't just a battery? What if it was part of something larger, something mobile, something the Sumerians used to move through their cities thousands of years before we invented the automobile? I found evidence that suggests exactly that, and it starts with a clay jar nobody knows how to explain. The Baghdad Battery sits in the National Museum of Iraq. It's a terracotta pot about 5 inches tall, discovered in 1936 at a Parthian settlement near modern Baghdad. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder. Inside that cylinder was an iron rod. The components were sealed with asphalt. When researchers filled a replica with an acidic solution like vinegar or wine, it produced roughly 1 volt of electricity. That's documented, that's reproducible. What nobody has explained is why a civilization from 2,000 years ago needed a device that generates electrical current. The standard academic answer is that it was used for electroplating gold onto silver. That explanation requires you to believe that ancient metallurgists developed electrical current generation for a single cosmetic application and then never mentioned it in any text, never scaled it, never applied it to anything else. I find that difficult to accept, but here's what makes this stranger. The Baghdad Battery isn't Sumerian. It's Parthian, dated to around 200 BCE. The Sumerians were gone by then. Their civilization collapsed millennia earlier. Yet when you go back further, when you dig into actual Sumerian sites, you find components that look disturbingly similar to the Baghdad Battery scattered across multiple locations. Clay jars with copper and iron elements, sealed vessels with metallic rods. And unlike the Parthian example, these Sumerian versions appear in clusters, dozens at a time, arranged in patterns that suggest they weren't individual curiosities but parts of a larger system. Nobody talks about that. The focus stays on the single Parthian jar because it's easier to dismiss one anomaly than to explain why an entire civilization might have been manufacturing electrical components at scale. I started looking at what the Sumerians actually wrote about movement and transport. The texts describe something they called the boat of heaven and the chariot of the gods. Standard interpretation treats these as mythological, metaphors for divine power or astronomical phenomena. But the language used to describe them is identical to the language used in administrative texts that document grain shipments and construction materials. The same scribes who wrote detailed inventories of wheat and barley wrote about celestial boats using the same practical, descriptive terminology. One tablet from Nippur describes a vehicle that moves without being pulled, that carries passengers without animals, that operates through what the text calls the brilliance of heaven. Another text from Lagash refers to chariots that run on the power of stones, not metaphorical stones. The text lists specific minerals, describes their arrangement, explains their function in powering movement. These aren't vague poetic descriptions. They're technical specifications written in the same documentary style the Sumerians used for everything else. The same culture that gave us the wheel, that invented writing specifically to track commerce and administration, that recorded surgical procedures and mathematical formulas with clinical precision, also wrote detailed accounts of vehicles powered by something other than muscle. Why do we read one set of their texts as literal documentation and another set as pure mythology, when they were written by the same people using the same language in the same contexts? The Sumerian city of Uruk covered nearly 2 square miles at its peak. Walking from one end to the other would take 30 minutes. The city had paved roads, documented in archaeological surveys. Those roads were wide, far wider than necessary for foot traffic or even animal-drawn carts. Some of the main thoroughfares in Uruk measured over 20 feet across, built with uniform stone paving, maintained across centuries. Cities don't build roads that wide unless something that wide needs to use them. Trade routes and footpaths don't require that kind of infrastructure investment. You build roads like that when you have vehicles, when you have traffic, when you have a transportation system that demands standardized infrastructure. And then there's the network itself. 5 Sumerian cities arranged in a geometric line across the Mesopotamian plain. Equal spacing between each one. Perfect alignment running northwest to southeast. That's not how cities develop naturally. That's not how trade routes work. That's how you build a transportation corridor. That's how you design a network where movement between nodes needs to be efficient, predictable, and fast. The tablets from these cities describe regular transport between them. Not occasional travel, not rare journeys, regular scheduled movement of goods and people using vehicles. The texts consistently describe as operating without animals. The word they use translates most directly as self-moving. What were they moving in? Were they? The physical evidence scattered across Sumerian sites suggests they had the electrical components. The texts say they had vehicles that moved without being pulled. The infrastructure shows they built roads for something wider and heavier than foot traffic. And nobody's asking what they were moving them with. The archaeological record from Sumerian sites contains something that shouldn't exist in a Bronze Age civilization. Small objects, cylindrical in shape, measuring between 2 and 6 inches in length. They're found in the ruins of temples, administrative buildings, and what appear to be workshop complexes. Each one consists of a copper cylinder, an iron rod running through the centre, and traces of an acidic substance that analysis has identified as vinegar or citrus-based solution. These aren't ceremonial objects, they're batteries. The Baghdad Battery is the most famous example, discovered in 1936 near modern Baghdad. But it's not alone. Similar devices have been found at multiple Sumerian sites across Iraq. They're consistent in construction, suggesting standardized manufacturing, and when replicated using the exact materials and configuration found in the originals, they produce roughly 1 volt of electricity. Mainstream archaeology calls them electroplating devices. The theory is that Sumerian craftsmen used them to coat objects with thin layers of gold or silver. That's a reasonable explanation for why you'd need a low-voltage electrical current in an ancient workshop. What it doesn't explain is why these devices appear in temple complexes and administrative centres where no metalworking was conducted, or why they're found alongside tablets that describe something the texts call the brilliance that never fades. The Sumerian word for this brilliance is the same word used in texts describing the Duranki at Nippur, the same brilliance that went out when Anzu stole the tablets of destinies, a glow that required no fire, no oil, no fuel source that would burn down or need replacement, something that just worked continuously as long as the correct stones were arranged correctly. Here's what makes this difficult to dismiss. The tablets don't just mention this brilliance in passing, they provide instructions. One text from Lagash describes the assembly of what it calls a light that comes from stones. It lists specific minerals, their arrangement, their connection through metal rods, and the liquid that must surround them. The description matches the construction of the Baghdad Battery exactly. Same components, same configuration, same function. But 1 volt isn't enough to power vehicles. That's barely enough to light a small bulb. So either the Sumerians were making batteries for some minimal practical purpose we haven't identified, or what archaeologists found are remnants of a larger system we haven't fully excavated. The temple complex at Eridu, the southernmost city in that geometric corridor, has a foundation layer that predates the Sumerian occupation by at least 1,500 years. Excavations in the 1940s documented something unusual in that earliest layer. Copper plating embedded in the stone floor in geometric patterns. Not decorative patterns, systematic ones. Parallel lines running the length of chambers, intersecting at right angles, connecting to small cylindrical chambers built into the walls at regular intervals. The excavation report noted this and moved on. The focus was on the temple structures above, the religious artifacts, the tablets. Nobody asked what those copper lines were for. Nobody tested whether they were part of a circuit. Nobody checked the cylindrical wall chambers to see if they once held devices matching the construction of the Baghdad Battery. That foundation is still there. The copper is still in the floor. The geometric pattern is documented in the archaeological survey. It's just filed under architectural features of unknown purpose. What if those weren't architectural features? What if that was infrastructure? A network of conductive pathways running through the temple floor, connecting to power sources positioned at intervals, distributing current throughout the structure. You'd build something like that if you needed to supply electricity to multiple points in a building, if you had devices that required power, terminals that needed connection, systems that operated continuously. The texts from Eridu describe the temple as the house that shines day and night. Not metaphorically shines, actually shines. The house where the brilliance never goes out, where the light comes from the walls themselves, where no torches are needed because the stones themselves glow. Read that as mythology and it's poetic. Read it as documentation and it's a description of electric lighting powered by a distributed current system running through the building's foundation. The Sumerians had the components. They had copper, iron, acidic solutions and the knowledge to combine them into functional cells. They had text describing assembly instructions for devices that produce brilliance from stones. They had infrastructure in their oldest temple showing systematic copper pathways built into the floor. And they had vehicles they described as moving without being pulled, powered by the arrangement of specific minerals. How much electricity can you generate if you're not limited to one small cylinder? What if you scale it up? What if the entire foundation of a building is the battery, with hundreds of cells connected in series, producing not 1 volt, but hundreds? Suddenly, those self-moving chariots start making sense. The temple foundation at Eridu isn't the only location showing this pattern. Baghdad, described in the texts as the bright place where ore is processed, has excavation reports from the 1930s, documenting something nobody bothered to explain. Metal chambers embedded in the temple floor at regular intervals, each one containing corroded metal rods surrounded by crystalline deposits that tested positive for acidic compounds. The chambers were connected by channels cut into the stone lined with copper sheeting. The excavation team catalogued it as ritual infrastructure and moved on to the tablets. Nobody asked why ritual infrastructure needed conductive pathways. Nobody tested whether those chambers could generate current. The geometry matches exactly what you'd build if you were creating a distributed power grid, multiple generation points, conductive channels linking them, a network capable of supplying electricity across a structure or even across a city. Scale that up from 1 temple to 5 cities arranged in a geometric corridor, and you're looking at infrastructure capable of powering vehicles that move between those cities along that specific route. The tablets from Uruk, the haven city positioned at the midpoint of the corridor, describe something called the Divine Road. Not a metaphorical path to enlightenment, an actual road connecting the 5 cities. The text specifies that it was smooth, that it shone, that it allowed the chariots of the gods to move swiftly without being pulled by animals. A conductive pathway running the length of the corridor. A charging infrastructure built into the road itself. Electric vehicles need more than batteries. They need somewhere to recharge. If you're moving between cities separated by signi, thick on distances, you need either massive onboard power storage or a continuous power source along the route. The Sumerians describe both, vehicles powered by mineral arrangements that could be recharged, and a road that itself provided power. Put a conductive surface in the road, run current through it, and any vehicle with the right connection can draw power while moving. We're experimenting with that technology now. Wireless charging roads that power electric vehicles through induction as they drive. The Sumerians might have built it 5,000 years ago. Here's what makes this difficult to dismiss. Every piece I've described exists in the archaeological record. The Baghdad Battery isn't theoretical, it's in a museum. The copper pathways at Eridu are documented in excavation reports. The metal chambers at Baghdad are catalogued. The tablets describing self-moving chariots and divine roads are translated and published. What doesn't exist is anyone connecting them into a coherent technological system. Because the moment you do that, you're suggesting the Sumerians had electric vehicles. And that's not a conclusion mainstream archaeology is prepared to accept, regardless of what the evidence shows. But the texts don't describe mythology. They describe engineering. They provide assembly instructions, material specifications, operational procedures. When they say arrange these minerals in this configuration and seal them in acidic liquid, that's not poetry. When they describe a road that allows vehicles to move without being pulled, that's not metaphor. When they build copper pathways into temple foundations and metal chambers into floors, that's not religious symbolism. It's infrastructure. The flooding that ended Sumerian civilization buried all of it. The cities were abandoned, the temples collapsed, the infrastructure was covered by sediment and forgotten. What got excavated in the 20th century was fragmentary, disconnected, interpreted through a framework that assumed ancient people couldn't possibly have had functional electricity. So the batteries became ritual objects. The conductive pathways became architectural features. The vehicles became mythological chariots. The engineering became religion. But strip away that assumption and read what's actually there. Chemical cells producing current. Distributed power networks built into buildings, vehicles described as moving without animals, roads that provided power, a civilization that wrote technical manuals describing how to build and operate electrical systems. They had it, they used it, they wrote it down. We found the evidence, catalogued it, and filed it under things we don't understand, because we've already decided what ancient people could and couldn't do. The Baghdad Battery sits in a museum drawer. The copper at Eridu is still in the ground. The tablets describing divine chariots are in academic archives. The 5-city corridor is visible on any map. Everything needed to reconstruct what they built is available. We just have to be willing to read the technical manual as a technical manual instead of a religious text. Because the Sumerians weren't writing mythology when they described their vehicles. They were writing documentation for technology that worked, that they used, that formed the infrastructure of their civilization until the water came and buried it all. And somewhere under the sand in Iraq, the components are still there, waiting for someone to take them seriously. The evidence is sitting in museums, documented in excavation reports, translated in academic journals. The batteries exist, the infrastructure exists, the texts describing their function exist. What doesn't exist is the willingness to connect them into what they clearly represent. A technological system we've been trained to believe was impossible. The Sumerians built electric vehicles, they powered them with chemical cells, they created charging infrastructure. They wrote technical documentation describing exactly how it all worked. And we found it, catalogued it, and decided it must mean something else because the alternative requires rewriting everything we think we know about the capabilities of ancient civilizations. The components are still there, underground in Iraq, waiting for excavation teams willing to ask different questions.